Good morning, friends. Welcome to the Immanuel 10 at 10. It's kind of a gloomy, overcast morning this today. Hopefully, we're going to get some much needed rain. The frost that we had over the past few days turned the early magnolia blooms brown, but there are lots of beautiful trees and flowers to be seen, so get out there and enjoy them. Well, this week in our 1 year chronological Bible reading plan, we continued our journey through the stories of King Saul and King David in 1st and 2nd Samuel, as well as parallel passages in 1st Chronicles. It may seem a little tedious to hear the same passages twice in Samuel and in Chronicles, but if you read them carefully, you'll notice slight differences that will give you insight into what each author wanted to emphasize. The books of Chronicles were actually written much later, based on 1st and 2nd Kings. In the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is placed towards the very end of all of their scriptures. Most likely, Chronicles was composed after the exile in Babylon, when Ezra and Nehemiah had led many of the people back to Jerusalem and started rebuilding the temple. You'll see that there's a greater emphasis on the construction and maintenance of the temple in Chronicles and on the hope of David's kingdom. We picked up the story in chapter 22 of 1st Samuel, where David was fleeing from Saul. King Saul viciously cut down anyone who supported David. God continued to use David and his men to save the Israelites from their enemies. Twice, David had opportunities to kill Saul, but refused to do so, since Saul was the Lord's anointed. Each time, Saul admitted that David was in the right and promised to leave him alone. David decided to flee to the land of the Philistines. Ironically, he settled in the town of Gath, where Goliath was from. He went out and raided towns near Shur in Egypt, but told the king of Gath that he was actually raiding towns in Israel. The king figured that David was making himself so odious to the people of Israel that he would be his servant forever. He gave David and his men the town of Ziklag. When the Philistines went to attack Israel, the other leaders did not want David with them. When he returned home, David found that his own town had been raided and burned by Amalekites, and all of their wives and sons and daughters had been captured. They pursued the Amalekites, overtook them, and destroyed them, recovering everything that had been taken, and all the people. The Psalms that we read this week were penned by David in response to times when he was fleeing from his enemies. They express great faith and trust in God during difficult times. In Psalm 56, David says, "In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord I trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? I am under vows to you, O God. I will present my thank offerings to you. For you have delivered me from death and my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in the light of life." Well, meanwhile, the Philistines defeated Saul and his army. Saul's 3 sons were killed, including Jonathan, David's best friend. And Saul was wounded so badly that he fell on his own sword and died. David lamented for them and then was anointed king over Judah. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, made Saul's son king over Israel, but that didn't last long. David grew stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker, a lot of it through treachery. Eventually, Abner went over to David's side, but David's commander Joab murdered Abner in revenge for his own brother's death. Then Saul's son was murdered, paving the way for David to become king over Israel as well. David conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it his capital. He had the Ark of God brought to the city and danced in the procession. David's wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, despised David for dancing in the streets. David replied that he had danced before the Lord and that he would become even more undignified than this to bring honor to God. Michal never had children, bringing an end to the house of Saul. The books of Samuel and Kings, as well as Chronicles, describe the overlapping rise and fall of Saul and David. They point to the hope of a greater king who will rule with justice and mercy over all the earth. Jesus is that king from David's line who has been crowned king of all creation through his suffering, death, and resurrection. Every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, we ask for God's kingdom to come in its fullness here on earth as it is in heaven. In the description of today's post, I'm including a link to the Bible Project study for 1 Samuel called When You Feel Powerless. We're going to be looking at that in our Bible study during adult class this Sunday at 9:30. Same time as Sunday school. So I hope to see you then and for worship this Sunday at 8:30 and 10:45 in person or online. Have a great week, everyone.